the idea for the book really kind of was a combination of different things that I was interested in. Part of it was the history of Long Beach, and part of it was the golden age of Hollywood. Part of it was the fact I love Joshua Tree in the desert, the high desert. I didn't really talk about that very much earlier, but so part of the book takes place in Joshua Tree, and there's a kind of a key scene in the transformation of the main character that takes place out there. But that's, kind of what happens out in the desert. I think throughout history, people have kind of transformational experiences when they're out there, under those conditions, and he certainly did. The arc of the story is a body's found in a very nice home in Palm Springs. It's a private detective from Long Beach. He's been shot, but he's been shot somewhere else, and they need to find out where he was shot. They find in the refrigerator of this house, ice box, they find a reel of motion picture film. And the motion picture film has been put in that refrigerator quite deliberately the implication is so that the police would find it and no one else. So the detective that's investigating the case, he quickly catches on that the car that the detective was driving bears signs that he was out in Joshua Tree. So that's part of his investigation. The fact that there's motion picture film involved. And as I said earlier, the detective can't see movies, which is, I started out thinking that this was kind of a unique thing, that the detective can't see the evidence in his case. He's investigating this crime, and the evidence that he needs to look at, he can't actually see. But that's really, if you think about forensic evidence like blood and fibers, you can't see that either. You need somebody who's an expert to show you what's important about that. So for him to see the evidence, he has to have somebody else look at it and tell him about it. So there's a scene in the book where he's gone to visit Charlie Chaplin in this hotel in Palm Springs because Chaplin's got a movie projector in his room. He's watching home movies of his mother. And Chaplin then watches the film and describes to the detective what's happening on the film, which is kind of a little naughty, which is funny when you think about it. Charlie Chaplin describing this stuff as though he's actually describing one of his own screenplays, but what he's describing is not anything you would have ever seen in a Chaplin movie. So he has to follow the leads that he finds in that film, which take him to MGM, and it takes him to meet this guy who is this very wealthy mogul he's kind of like a cross between Max Factor and I don't know. He's a wannabe film mogul, but he basically owns this company that makes makeup, women's makeup, theatrical makeup, and then he owns a bunch of other companies along the way, medical related companies and stuff. So he's incredibly wealthy. He's married to a woman who the main character, the detective, actually has known previously, but now she's starting out as a fledgling starlet in Hollywood, and this guy's trying to promote her career, and in turn using her to promote his cosmetics. So he has the line called Red Blossoms, which is her color, and that comes into play in the story as well. So he's then trying to find out what happened to this detective, where it happened, who did it to him, and solve the case. I think the real thing about the book is that he has had a rough upbringing, a rough childhood. He grew up in a family with a father who was abusive. He was actually a criminal. One of the things that I learned about when I was doing my research was something called the Camorra. And it happens that the Camorra, I'd never heard of before, it was in Italy like the mafia. And the mafia came to the United States. The Camorra did as well, but the Camorra were never known. So there's a joke in the book about how his father was in the Camorra. Somebody asked him what that is, and he says, well, you've heard of the mafia? And they said, well, yeah. And he says, okay, the Camorra is they're better than the mafia. Well, what makes you say that? He says, well, you've heard of the mafia. So So he grew up with this abusive man who caused him this physical injury that took away his persistence of vision, which is kind of, to me, an allusion to the idea of being able to have a life. He's an alcoholic. His life is just spiraling out of control at this point. He's got a lot of problems, and so he's in a bad place. So this book is basically showing him, he's bottoming out, and it's him being reborn in a way in this mine out in Joshua Tree when he learns about persistence of vision from this German cinematographer who's hiding out in this mine. So, and then there's a thing about his mother. His mother had been involved in a fire in a factory in New York and was almost killed. But she was rescued by firemen at the last minute when many of the other women in the building had leaped from windows and were killed in the street. So he finds out from one of his father figures. This is a kind of a theme in the book, is that there are several men who represent father figures to him. And one of them is Fiorello LaGuardia, who I discovered again through research, although in this case it was being at Ellis Island, that LaGuardia was actually a child advocate at Ellis Island in 1904 when Moretti came through as a 4-year-old. And so I said, well, okay, interesting. He's going to basically take this kid under his wing because the kid's abandoned there by his parents because he coughed during the exam. And they quarantined him. So the rest of his mother and his brother and sister went into Manhattan to go to their apartment, and they left him on Ellis Island. So Fiorello LaGuardia is a character who shows up in the backstory, and then at the end there's an epilogue where they're at the cemetery in Virginia near Washington. They're at Arlington Cemetery, and Fiorello LaGuardia is there. And he's talking to Moretti, and he tells him, you really should come back, and because he hasn't seen his family since he was a kid. He said, your mother's keeping pigeons on the roof. And Moretti's amazed that she can go up on the roof. And LaGuardia tells him, you can get over anything. And that's kind of where that's coming from for me, is he's got to get over this experience that he's had, and it's up to him. I mean, nobody's going to help you fix it. But if his mother is able to go up on the roof after being trapped, up in a window high up above the street, then maybe he can get it back together. Long Beach is a place that my family moved to in 1910. And very quickly they became involved in the development of the city. They were business people. My grandfather was a developer. He built a 12-story building at the corner of what was American Avenue and now Long Beach Boulevard and East Broadway. That survived the earthquake in '33. He developed Bixby Knolls area. They were members of the Pacific Coast Club. They went to the schools. When I grew up in Long Beach, everybody knew a Deeble. It was like that. So, everywhere I went, which Deeble are you? So there's a lot of history of Long Beach that's intertwined with my family. And, I heard stories growing up about the Pacific Coast Club. I love architecture. I love old buildings. In fact, we were filming a movie when I was in high school, and they were opening the new City Hall. They built the new City Hall, which is now going to be the old City Hall pretty soon. And they destroyed a building that was nearby, a 10-story building, and my brother and I were there filming it. I love this place. This is my roots, and I come back here. I've left 3 times, and every time I've come back. Right now I'm living in the community that my grandfather developed, and I got to tell you, there's nothing more amazing than walking around there thinking, this was a bean field. This was a bean field before my grandfather turned it into this beautiful community. So I have a really, really strong connection to this place. Yeah, I incorporated it into the book by having parts of it take place here. The private detective who's found dead, his office is in the Juergens Trust building, which is no longer there. The investigation takes the main character to the pike. I mean, one of the pictures, I talked about the picture of my uncle and Stan Laurel during my presentation, but one of the other images that I found in the research I did at the Historical Society was of the pike. You know, the pike was called the Coney Island of the West back in the day, and it was this amazing place. The bathhouses, the midway, the roller coaster. People just flocked to the place. So they had this part of it called the Walk of 1,000 Lights, and it was strings of light bulbs that ran along the midway. And at sunset every night, they would turn them on, and that was it. It was the Walk of 1,000 Lights. But when those lights were turned on every night, people would stop in awe and look at the lights. And I even make a comment about it in the book about how Moretti had seen Times Square. And this is really not anything that spectacular compared to seeing Times Square, but at the same time, what it was for me was the charm of it. It wasn't the lights, it was the fact that at that time, those lights were amazing. So that's kind of where that came from. When I was growing up in Long Beach, the Pike was the place that any production studio that needed a seedy location would use. I mean, you just didn't go to the Pike. It was not a good place. So it had changed a great deal. And I kind of thought, yeah, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see what it was like back then. So I wrote scenes that took place there. So that's kind of what I did with it. Is I just used my imagination and incorporated those locations into the story. I'm working on a couple of different things. One of them is the book that's a collection of the sketches that I've been doing. Many years ago, I started writing these. I called them essays at the time, but I had gone to my 10-year high school reunion, and something had happened in my life that was pretty traumatic, which was my mother was murdered, and right before our reunion, there was it came back into the news again. And so I was like going to my reunion thinking, oh my God, I'm going to spend the whole night having people ask me questions about this. And that was kind of disconcerting. Nobody did, which was great. Until Duncan Kennedy walked up to me and said, when I heard about what happened to your mother, and I just kind of got ready. And he said, I remember when she was our den mother in Cub Scouts. And I stopped and went, she was our den mother? And I realized I had forgotten that. And one of the things that happens when you experience trauma is your mind suppresses things to try and help protect you. And I thought, what's happening is it's protecting me by suppressing not just the things that are negative, but some of the good stuff is going too. I need to start writing these things down. So I began writing these essays, which I now call sketches, because all I'm doing is just writing really short descriptions of something that happened that's a memory, which might get lost. So I did a batch of those, and then many years later started doing some stuff on Facebook. And as I started publishing those, my friends started commenting on them and liking them and encouraging me to write more, and I did. I wrote more and more and more, and got to the point where they started saying, you should publish these as a book. And so that's the next book. It's called Throwback Thursdays, a sketchbook. And it's going to be those stories combined with some additional ones that I'm going to use to kind of provide bridges between stories and extend other stories. And then they'll be organized kind of around themes. I mean, I have a lot of stories I wrote about my dad and my mom, a lot of stories about strange encounters I've had with people, it's a wide variety. One of them was actually published in a literary magazine last year, Lummox Journal number 6. That was called The Getaway, On the Run in the Getaway Car. So that's one. And then I have another book that's going to follow Persistence of Vision as a sequel with the main character and some of the other characters, which was suggested to me by a colleague while I was working on the early drafts of the first book. He and I were commuting together in the mornings, and I came out to the car one morning, and every morning I'd be writing and get in the car and tell him about what I was working on. I got in the car one morning, and there was a bunch of paper on the seat, and I picked it up, and it's a magazine article that he'd Xeroxed. I said, what's this? And he said, that's your next book. I said, well, okay. And I look at this thing, and it's something called the bonus march. I'd never heard of the bonus march. And so I read this thing, and apparently this is, now I hear about it more often, but the incident was in 1932, the veterans of World War I who had in their contracts with the U.S. government that they would receive a bonus at some point in the future, which I believe is like 33, 34. But the Depression hit. And by 32, people were really hurting. And so they petitioned the government to pay the bonus early. And Congress voted on it, and they voted against that. And President Hoover at the time, he said, no, we're not going to do that. So they marched on Washington. The veterans of World War I marched on Washington and built a tent city adjacent to Washington, D.C. Well, the tent city was dubbed Hooverville, as all subsequent tent cities were. And Hoover was not pleased by that. So he ordered the military to tear it down, burn it, and get these people out of town. These people having been veterans who were with their families and their wives and their children in this tent city. So Douglas MacArthur, who they fought with in World War I, brought in tanks and soldiers, and they were routed, and the tent city was burned to the ground. And when I heard this, I thought, this is horrible. And never having heard of this episode in history, and I studied history in school, this wasn't something they talked about. So I decided, yeah, you know what? That's the backstory of my next book. He's going to go back there because my main character is a veteran of World War I, and it made sense that he would go back there to support his fellows in that effort. And so I decided something's going to happen that's going to set this in motion. And so I'm 5 chapters into that right now. And it's happening kind of the way the first book did. As I write it, it's writing itself. That's how I know when I'm on the right track, is when things just start clicking. So that's what I'm working on now. Self-publishing was not something so much I wanted to do as, it was go through the trials of finding a publisher or an agent to represent you. After we had done these interviews with literary agents, I realized that it almost didn't matter. What we were hearing from these people was, oh, self-publishing poo-poo, but that all the publishing companies were shifting the responsibility of promotion onto the authors, which means you need to have this, they call it platform, right? How much are you willing to do to support the promotion of your book? And I thought, well, so basically, if I do it on my own, I'm going to be showing them that. So I decided, okay, I got a website. I started a Facebook page for my first book. I now have a second Facebook page for the second book. I began posting articles that I found that were related to the subject. I do these Google alerts, so every day I get a list of articles that appear on the internet about things related to my book. So Laurel and Hardy, John Barrymore, Lon Chaney, the Golden Age of Hollywood, Palm Springs, historic, Los Angeles, historic. It's so the stories that are coming in, I'm then sharing as a way to try and keep my page visible to the people that follow it. So it's not like I recommend necessarily to people that they self-publish, but it's so easy to do now that, I won't say anybody can do it, but anybody can do it. Well, it took me a long time to write this book. It took me 25 years. And I have to say, anybody that wants to do something creative, don't let anybody talk you out of it. And I said this before, especially if that person is yourself. Because I did the best thing I've ever done in my life. It just took me a long time to do it. And my life has changed as a result. I haven't sold tons of copies of the book yet, but it's amazing what's happening to me as a result. I love being an author. There's a Facebook page for Persistence of Vision called Persistence of Vision, the novel. There's a page for the Throwback Thursdays book, Throwback Thursdays, a sketchbook. I'm on Twitter, Deeble. I'm on Facebook, I think it's Stephen Deeble. I have an Instagram account, not really doing a lot on that yet, but hopefully we'll be doing that soon. That's really pretty much it as far as social media goes. I have a website, stephendeeble.com. Sign up, give me your email address, and I'll put you on my mailing list.